everybody, and a huge thanks for joining us today for a discussion on setting standards for technical assessments. This is a lead dev webinar created in partnership with Codility. The webinar will last roughly 45 minutes, after which both myself and the panelists will be heading over to the lead dev Slack to answer some of your questions in the hiring channel. So be sure to get on Slack if you are not already. And we may also have some time to answer a couple of questions live, so feel free to submit those through the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we'll get to them if we can towards the end. If not, we'll answer them in Slack. So let's get started today with some introductions. My name is Josie Haynes, and I'm the VP of Software Engineering and Head of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Tile. Today, I'll be joined by Frank, who's the Technical Program Manager for Google, Dominique, who's a VP of Engineering at Wealthsimple, Alex, who's the Senior Software Engineer at Nucella, and Brendan, who's an Engineering Manager at Codility, so they can share their experiences and insights. I'm going to give each of them a moment to introduce themselves. Frank, do you want to get started?
Sure. Hey, everyone. My name is Frank. I'm a technical program manager at Google. I work on the cloud, privacy, operations, and engineering team. That's my primary role. In addition to that, I'm also a Google interviewer. I interview for TPM, PGM roles, as well as software engineering. And I also wear a third hat where I work on the Google Tech Exchange projects, where we teach software engineering concepts to students at historically Black colleges and Hispanic serving institutions, as well as interview prep and mock interviews with them. I'm happy to help and share my insights with you all. I've done a bunch of interviews, and I've been on the other side of the table many times in my career as well.
Thank you, Frank. Looking forward to hearing your insights. Next, Dominique, do you want to give your introduction?
Hi, everyone. My name is Dominique. My pronouns are she, her. I lead the majority of engineering at Wealthsimple, and as such, I've put in place a lot of our processes like our software engineering interview process, how we start interviewing for staff and principal engineers, as well as all of our engineering managers. And I'm really excited to be on the panel to be able to share a lot of the inclusive technical assessment practices that we've put in place.
Awesome. Thank you, Dominique. Next, Alex, do you want to go ahead?
Hey, I'm Alex. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a senior engineer at Nucella, which is an education tech company, and I work on our content management system there. I'm really excited to be on this panel because as an IC, I'm somebody who helps deliver technical assessments, but I also have been through the ringer and have taken them several times. So I'm really interested in thinking about where the process can be better, where it can be more humane. And I'm excited to hear from the rest of the panelists today as well.
Awesome. Yes, thank you, Alex. I'm definitely excited to get that IC point of view as well in this panel. And then finally, last but not least, Brendan, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Brendan McCullum. Pronouns are he, him. I'm an engineering manager at Codility that offers solutions for hiring and assessing candidates. And I've sat on the other side, like many of the people here, I've sat on the other side of the table more times. I was a software engineer for many years before I moved into software leadership. And I'm just really excited to hear what some of the other ideas that people have and to share a little bit about my own ideas and our ideas at Codility for helping make a more equitable and inclusive and standardized process.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to hear your insights. And so, to set a little bit of context, when you're hiring engineers, you're likely to be holding a technical interview as part of the process. But even though the concept of a technical assessment makes sense, a lot of organizations don't have standards in place. And if we don't have those standards, you could end up having inconsistency and bias and having actually a poor reflection of the candidate's potential. And it can actually be a bad experience for the candidate as well. And so I really wanted to take the time to go through some questions with the panel so we can dive further into this topic and see how we can improve this in the tech industry. So first, I wanted to start with, what do you mean by technical assessment? And so I think this is a great question for everybody on the panel to potentially answer. But Frank, do you want to get started?
Yeah, so the technical assessment really comes down to the core fundamentals of the role and what the candidate is going to be expected to do or perform once they've joined that team. So when I think of the technical assessment, to me, that kind of ties really, it leaps forward to the performance reviews, how that person is going to be evaluated in that role. And does the technical assessment give me insight into maybe what that first performance review is going to look like? So there should be some alignment there between those. That's kind of the fundamental take on it. Of course, there's more we'll expound in the conversation, but to me, that's the good starting point. Where's the
Awesome.
performance review and how are they going to be measured?
Awesome. I love that insight. Yeah, one of the things that I share a lot is, if you use impact job descriptions where you can do like 30, 60, and 90-day goals, you can then use those for the performance review and evaluation. And it helps, again, with reducing the bias. So that's a great idea. Thank you. Dominique, do you have some additional insights here?
Yeah, I think, a technical assessment can be any interview that assesses like a subset of the competencies on your matrix. From a technology perspective, I usually put these in two broad categories. So like specific technology expertise, like APIs, data modeling, even like knowledge of specific libraries that may be really, really relevant for your company. But they can also be more about how you apply that knowledge. So your ability to perform code reviews, draft technical design, and like facilitate decision-making on topics such as languages, libraries, or process improvements. That's like literally one of our competencies from our matrix. And so making sure that you're pulling those in is one of the things that we do as well.
Awesome. Alex, what about you?
Yeah, I'm already loving these answers because I think that they point so much to things that we're going to be talking about later in the discussion about what makes a fair and reasonable technical assessment. But when I was thinking about this, I was trying to think about, okay, what differentiates these kinds of assessments from other parts of the interview? Is it that it's a solvable problem? Is it that it requires specific domain knowledge? And really, I don't think that's the differentiator. I think, as Frank mentioned earlier, the thing is that these assessments are meant to kind of mimic or approximate a day of an engineer and the responsibilities of an engineer. And so to what Dominique was saying, that can look many different ways. And it really broadens out what we think about as technical.
Yes, I love that. And Brendan, what about you?
Yeah, so I think other people have touched on a lot of the things that I was going to say. I would just say that, I think you can also consider a technical assessment as broader than simply one component of the live interviewing process. I mean, some companies will do things like a take-home project, or Codility offers our code check automated assessments. So those are other forms of technical assessment that can also be integrated into your process as well.
Awesome. Thanks for those insights. And, tied very closely to this, and it's something a few of you have already touched on, how do you ensure that the assessment is actually equitable and fair? And so, Brendan, why don't we start with you there?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a big question. I guess this is a difficult question to answer in the scope of this panel, but I would say like one of the big things that we focus on is that the interview the assessment should be narrowly focused on skills that are relevant to the job at hand. It should be focused around the work that candidate or that employee would be doing. So that means it shouldn't require sort of extraneous ethnocultural knowledge or obscure facts. And, for instance, like you shouldn't have a bunch of questions about baseball statistics, because like that would be excluding, non-Americans, but also people who just aren't that interested in baseball. So making sure that your assessment is relevant to the work that person will be doing is important, I think, in making sure it's fair.
Definitely. Alex, do you want to provide your insights here?
Yeah, I definitely have ideas about how to make these kinds of assessments more equitable, but I guess I want to use a baseball analogy, throw a curveball, and ask whether or not that's even the question that we should be asking in a work environment. I think ultimately, like as Brendan was saying, that's a really hard question for us to answer on this panel. And I might argue, and I was talking with some colleagues about this throughout the week, who were also sharing this idea with me that, like, I don't know if it's possible for us to make these things equitable. And so rather, what if we took a more pessimistic approach and asked ourselves, okay, in what ways is our assessment not equitable and not inclusive, and to whom is it not inclusive? And what if we continually ask ourselves that question and make sure that we are comfortable with the answer? I think that that's a much more realistic kind of framing of the question. For instance, our team talks a lot about, okay, do we want someone to come in with a project that they tell us about or have a take-home project? That's an interview I love giving because it gives a candidate the chance to talk about something that they have domain expertise on. And the downside of that is that someone has to take the time to write that assessment, and likely that is unpaid time. So everything always kind of has an ethical trade-off, and we need to consistently be asking ourselves the question of what those are. The one thing I'll add is that it's also really possible to be transparent about those trade-offs. And it's possible to say, like, look, we know that this isn't the greatest solution, but we've thought about it and we've decided to go forward with it. And that's why we're choosing to design our assessments this way.
Yes. And, I think you commented on the transparency piece. And I do think that that is so crucial and important in the hiring process there. So thank you for that insight. And Frank, what about you? Oh, you're still muted.
After 2 years of pandemic, we thought I'd be used to that by now. I really like Alex's answer to that question. I hadn't thought about it that way, and it definitely has me asking myself some questions internally. I think one way that we can contribute to the, making the assessments more equitable and fair is focusing on the interviews and how the data is collected and how the data will be evaluated. I like to, during the interview process of, generally hiring someone, you're going to collect a bunch of information about them, but is that information relevant to the technical interview? If it's not, you can withhold that information from the interviewers. They just need to know the candidate and where they need to be, where the Zoom link or what conference room to show up, and then to present that information. And then the data that they collect, certain things like racial bias, age bias, sexual orientation, those things aren't relevant. So they shouldn't be a part of anything that's collected if it's purely on a technical assessment. And one thing I always, I also train interviewers, and one thing I'll constantly tell interviewers is to always be scanning and have an internal feedback loop, make aware of the biases that we have, and that you're always looking to remove those. And then in the data that you collect, like I try and use gender neutral terms, nothing that describes the candidate and has anything to do with the technical skills that I'm assessing should go into the feedback that I'm giving. And then I like to have the interview as blind as possible. So then that information, that data that's collected, that interviewer has, had FaceTime, they've interacted with that person, and they may have started to form some opinions. So what I like to do is hand that information off to another person, another interviewer who's never met this candidate, and they're purely assessing the data. They're looking at what they did and the feedback that was given to that, and then have them make the decision, because they're now 2 levels abstracted away from who that candidate is, and they just have the technical data to rely
on. Thank you for all of those insights. It was great getting those different perspectives.
Could I add one more thing to that?
Oh, absolutely, of course.
I think what Frank was saying also kind of jogged me to add, are the criteria that you are evaluating your candidate on falsifiable? Like, is it provable? So in preparation for this panel, I've been thinking about this in relation to actually like values-based criteria and how kind of tricky that area can be. I think a lot of companies are moving toward this concept of values fit, values add, and like evaluating based off of company values. But how do you prove in an interview, especially a coding interview, that someone is like, you know, challenges authority or is creatively respectful, or whatever kind of like lingo we want to use to talk about these values. So I think it's something that can be done even in technical assessments, but making sure that there is like a clear kind of failure state and a clear kind of provable state of success there.
Yeah, and to add to that, one of the things that I think is useful is, when you're defining your competencies and you're defining the questions you're going to ask, actually just saying what like good and bad looks like for each question, right? I think a lot of times when people look at structured interviews, they stop at just creating the questions, but don't actually create like what good looks like and what bad looks like. And so then again, when you have those round tables, you can end up having more bias. So, I think, like everybody was talking about, you can't get rid of bias. We have unconscious bias, and at the end of the day, it helps us. Like that's how we know how to drive a car and walk down the street without having to think about it, right? So it's not always a bad thing, but we also have to slow down when making these sorts of decisions. And so that actually leads to my next question here, which is, again, under this idea of making a comprehensive assessment, who do you actually get involved in creating this technical assessment? And so, Dominique, why don't we get started with you there?
Awesome. I mean, I think number one, people that do the actual job, because they know what they do day to day. They have a great idea of what success looks like. And often they can be a lot more creative than you would be as an outsider coming up with what you can do. So like that's actually how we came up with our staff engineer and principal engineer loop. It never occurred to me to do this, but they included what we call now a technical proposal review. So it's essentially like a design doc that has a couple of things and catches like some design flaws, but also just generally gives an opportunity for them to demonstrate how they can mentor and provide feedback to someone while also assessing technical competencies. And it's like a thing that you are actually expected to do as a staff engineer very, very regularly. I also, it's ideal if the people that you pick will also participate in the interview process, because it ends up meaning that they feel a lot more empowered to update the interview if it's not working, or if, let's say, you create a rubric to assess against, if the exact details actually don't really line up to the kind of information that you're getting out of the interview, updating it, because we're never going to get it right on the first try. Other people that I've considered that we've included are like our hiring managers or other hiring managers that are interviewing for similar roles, so that you can really make sure that you're equitable across the team and not just picking like one team doing things. Like we really try and make sure that it's consistent regardless of what team you end up interviewing for. And members of the people team, imagine that. Like if you want to make sure that you're aligning to your company values, even if you don't have perfect process yet, like eventually your company may come up, like we just launched some values-based behavioral questions, et cetera, involving them to at the very least review and provide feedback from like the perspective of how they can add to the team and what are some consistent behaviors we want to look for, is a really great way to make sure that you're not limiting yourself only to technical feedback.
Absolutely. Love those answers. And, I think a great insight is also how, candidates end up interfacing with the people team, and non-technical counterparts as well can also be very telling in figuring that out. And so, Frank, what about you? Who are you involving in the process?
Yes, so I liked Dominique's response. I hope I pronounced it right. Yeah, I like Dominique's response to that. I definitely kind of treat it like a grooming session where, you only get to vote on story points if you're going to be contributing and doing the work. So you are going to be contributing to, you are doing this type of work, then you are coming up with the assessments to to do that. And I take that one step further. I like to see the team that comes together to do that to be at the level that we're interviewing this person for, one level above and one level below. Because I think those are outcomes that I've seen in interviews. I've come into interviews at a particular, expecting a particular level, and the performance I'm seeing, there's potential there, but maybe they're not performing at the level. They have like the fundamental skills, but they're not at the level of expectation. So that's someone I can work with. We can grow them to the next level. Or I've also come into where I've been interviewing in person, and they're knocking it out of the park. They're way ahead of what I'm like in the interview, taking notes of stuff I need to Google after the interview. So I like to involve at the level L+1 and L-1. And then I also like to have those people involved in the reviewing of the technical assessment. So like you said, the people closest to the work are creating the assessments. They are giving the assessments. They're also grading the assessments. And then like that rubric that someone mentioned earlier, I think that rubric should, for every question, kind of break down, okay, at this level, at the entry level, I would expect this type of response in this scope, versus at the senior level, I would expect this type of response. And at the staff level, they may mention things like this, or they may take it to this level. And then having those types of people who actually do the work, then also evaluate the technical assessment as well. So I think it's an entire pipeline. It's not just the assessment, but who's giving it, who's reviewing it, and then how's it being evaluated.
I love that you included that, because yes, I think there's a lot of behind the scenes work that goes into interviewing that people really need to commit to for it to be a process that works, because it does take time. And so it's something that managers need to also give time to their employees to be able to focus on these things as well, which I think is very important and crucial. So I love these answers. Another person that I like to include in interviews is cross-functional partners who may interface with the employee that we're hiring. So again, that ends up being both from hey, how do they interface with somebody else? And again, figuring out like, hey, do they work well with people outside of engineering as well? Go ahead.
Have one more thing to add. One other person that should be included in the technical assessment is the candidate themselves. Not only do we assess them, but they're assessing us too. So I like to get feedback back from the candidates on what their interview experience was like. We also collect metrics on our interviewers. So we do some type of calibration in the beginning before we let you go out and start doing interviews, but then we collect metrics on that as well. Like, at your level, you've rated these candidates as, let's say, senior level developers, but your peers who have also interviewed these candidates either rated them at that level, one up or one down. So we're also looking at the calibration of what the technical interviewer is seeing. So I think including and getting feedback from the candidate is also a crucial piece to creating effective technical assessments.
Absolutely. And I love that you're including the candidate there in this, because you're right. It is such an important part, and you can get such valuable feedback if you just take the time to ask. So thank you there. So next is, what competencies or skills are you evaluating from the technical assessment? And so Alex, why don't we start with you on this one?
Yeah, I really appreciated what Frank just added about involving the interviewer in understanding, what is the technical assessment and is it successful? Because one of the reasons I really wanted to talk about this question was that, as an interviewer, I'm certainly evaluating competencies and skills, which I'll talk about in a minute, but also, as an interviewee, I'm evaluating the competencies and skills that are expected of me when I'm taking a technical assessment. And so there have been times when a technical assessment seems so out of scope of either the level or the job description that I almost know immediately going into it that whatever the company is looking for right now, or wherever the company is at right now, is not where I want to be as a contributor. And so I like really strongly want to yell that for any ICs who are on the webinar, that these opportunities are always a moment for you to also assess the needs of a company, the thought process behind how they design their interview process, and what they are kind of prioritizing in their engineering hires. The one thing that I'll add that's like a direct answer to the question is, working in ed tech, I think we really care about language. We really care about mentoring. And so my kind of approach as someone who sits on interview panels is that, of course, I'm looking for technical correctness. Of course, I'm looking for competency and like basic understanding. But at the end of the day, I think technical skills are the easiest thing to teach about the work that we do. I even think that communication and presentation skills are things that can be taught somewhat easily. But what is harder to teach is curiosity and humility, empathy. And so I think really being able to hone in on how someone goes about solving a problem and how they work is something that I'm always looking for, even in the technical interview process.
Absolutely. And I love how you tied that all back together to, some of the insights that Frank was sharing. And so actually, Frank, do you want to share more thoughts on what you're thinking about evaluating?
Yeah, when I'm doing a technical assessment, first of all, I'm on a team now where we don't do much pair programming, but I pretty much treat every technical assessment like a pair programming experience. I love pair programming. Extreme programming is one of my favorite paradigms. But when I am, and I tell the candidate that we're a team and we got to solve this problem together. So use me as a resource. If you need to go on Stack Overflow or whatever you have to do, we just have to get this done by the end of the time that we have together. But while we're working through that process together, I'm really looking at three things: aptitude, knowledge, and experience. So some of the questions are going to be hypothetical. We got to solve, we got to create a widget that does a thing. Some of them are trying to assess their experience and have they come across these situations before in the wild, or is it just, I've built a bunch of, projects in my portfolio. And so I'm looking for those things, really those three things. And I think that also kind of goes back into question 3 a little bit. I kind of see technical interviews also kind of falling into 2 categories, and that's really understanding what you're hiring for. Sometimes you're hiring because it's something new. You're going in a different direction. There is something new, and you are building something that your company maybe has not done before. I've experienced this before. Or you're going to augment something that's already going and you're expanding, or you're increasing. There's already knowledge and expertise within your company or within your organization on that particular thing. I experienced this in the past when I was working for I was working as a DevOps engineer at another company, and this company, that was in the same city, was starting their DevOps journey. So they couldn't really interview for it because they didn't have a DevOps program. But I had relationships through them with different meetups and things like that. And it's like, hey, I know you don't work for us, but would you be willing to volunteer and sit in, help us develop some, you're a DevOps engineer, could you help us develop our technical assessment and sit in on an interview or 2 until we get some people on? And, I was like, sure, I don't mind helping out, using my, off time to do that. And I think that's really good to look at whether it's, am I building something new or am I going in a totally different direction? So when I'm developing the technical interview, I need to do that. And then all those resources that are available, using all the resources that are available to me, even if they're not in my company. So that's an option for you as well.
Yeah. It's an interesting point. Like, how do you interview or how do you assess for a skill or function that isn't present in that company. And I've experienced that, at a previous job, we were trying to build out a security engineering team, but we didn't have a security engineering team. So how do you assess security engineers if you can't do that already? And I guess, like, shameless plug, like, this is where a tool like Codility might be helpful, because we have IO psychologists, and we have people who've created content and that is designed to assess for a variety of functions, and maybe we can help you even if you don't have that function within your own company. So, but it's a really interesting point of, like, getting something new versus building on something that you already have.
Yes, awesome. Thank you all for all of those insights. And, tying back to something Frank was talking about earlier with respect to making sure that you're evaluating people at the right level. Karen Catlin, who wrote a book called Better Allies, has a story in it where her and her partner happened to both actually interview at the exact same company for the exact same role on the exact same day. And they were actually in rooms next to each other, and with pretty much the same interview panel. And they walked out of the interviews, and she felt that was a really easy interview. Her partner walked out and was like, oh my gosh, that was the hardest interview panel I've ever done. So basically, because she was a woman, they basically downgraded all the questions, whether intentionally or not. And literally, not in a lot of situations can you have a story like this, because most times people don't know each other. But, I share this because it is important to take into account and think about these biases when you're walking in and asking these questions, and really thinking about, like, what level you're evaluating somebody on. Awesome. And so that actually kind of ties into the next question, which is, how do you know your assessments are aligned with the job requirements? And so, Dominique, do you want to get started there?
I mean, this is a really hard, you can try, but there are lots of ways that you have to also make sure that you've got a feedback loop in place to ensure that you've actually got it right. And so, in theory, and what we usually do is we always start with competencies. So if you have a framework, use it. If you don't, it's time to start. This is the perfect way actually to brainstorm what are your competencies, and then bring that into your first draft of what will eventually become a matrix. We did that. Actually, we didn't have a management and engineering management competency framework when I joined Wealthsimple. And so that was the way that we established V1, which didn't even have differentiated levels, but then that's how we were able to build on it afterwards. It was also a great way to train our existing managers that were participating in the process, what's expected of an engineering manager, as we started shifting exactly what it meant to be an engineering manager at Wealthsimple. And then the other thing is you don't have every interview doesn't have to cover everything. So pick the most important ones, which isn't every single competency, and weave those through the set of interviews at the right time. So at the beginning, you should really focus on the critical ones that to be successful in this role, you must have, or at the very least, a little bit of a basic aspect of it. And then the other piece that I think people often forget is, if you don't weave in enough about the level differentiation, so what does it mean to be a senior software engineer at your company, for example, then you're guaranteed to get to the end and then not know how or which offer to make to someone. And so really think about your competencies and what the difference is between different levels in terms of how they show up, so that you can tailor your questions to get there. And then just a couple things around feedback loops, in terms of how do you actually know that you've picked the right ones. We've looked at a couple of things. Often it ties back to performance. So how do they do once they've actually joined the team? We do a calibration every 3 months. And then as part of that, we also assess if people have been misleveled, and which is a really good indicator of whether we might need to go back and look at addressing that in some of our interviews.
I love those. Those are great. Alex, I would love your perspective from the IC side of things.
Yeah, again, I think what Dominique shared ties so well into what Frank was talking about earlier in terms of who helps contribute to the process. And if we think about this really holistically, we're also talking about how do we build engineering culture at an organization, right? what does it mean to have an interviewing panel of folks if all of those folks don't share a common knowledge about what makes a mid-level or a senior engineer at a company? So I think largely, like, we should be thinking about, are the job requirements even correct from the very first get-go? Who is involved in writing those? Have they been proofread? Has someone underneath this position, this level, contributed their ideas about what someone at this level should be doing at the job? I think people across the kind of spectrum of levels all have input on helping define what that looks like at a company. And then I'd say, okay, if those job descriptions are making sense, are your assessments also being designed by engineers? And can your engineers take them? Can your engineers pass them? What does it look like to do a kind of anonymous issuance of an assessment with your team every once in a while to see how good of a fit it actually is for their day-to-day work? And then I also think, we love an algorithmic interview in this industry, but I think making sure that something is really well scoped and as close to domain specific as possible is really helpful. I know that it's kind of the thing that we have to do in a technical assessment, but going through those kinds of interviews are always more enjoyable if it feels related to the job at hand.
Absolutely. I love some of those insights, and I loved can your engineers pass your assessment? Because I've definitely seen like engineers practicing assessments, and I'm like, if you can't pass it yourself, why are you asking others this question?
Yeah, I want to jump in there. I like what Alex said. It reminds me of that tweet by Sebastian Ramirez. He was the creator of the FAST API, and he was posting that he was looking through job postings, and he saw one that he was interested in, but they were looking for 4 years of experience with FAST API, and it had only been a year and a half since he created FAST API, so he couldn't apply for the role. So that lining up of the technical assessment, the job requirements and what's expected in the actual role is key. And something unique, I think I can talk about this, something unique that we have at Google, and I haven't seen this at any of the other companies that I've been in my career, is that we actually have interview clubs. So you can be trained as a general interviewer and handle some of the non-technical topics, and then you can have you go do add-on training to get specialties for like TPM or SWE or systems engineer. So we actually have interview clubs, and you can join an interview club, and you and another interviewer are paired up, and you interview each other and give each other feedback. So it's interviewing in itself is a skill while you are providing information, observing the candidate, taking notes. You got a lot going on as an interviewer as well, and that's a skill that needs to be practiced and honed as well. And so, sometimes if it's been a couple of weeks since I had an interview and I have an interview on my calendar, I might hop in the interview club and do a practice dry run with another Googler, or if I'm interviewing at a level I haven't interviewed at in a while, I might get a candidate or get someone from the interview club that's at that level and interview. So I'm making sure that I'm calibrating my expectations of what I'm going to get out of this interview.
I love that idea because, one of the things you talked about, I think is so crucial, is the practice part. It's a skill. Like you said, interviewing is a skill, and it is something we can definitely get better at with practice. And especially, sometimes people don't interview all that often, right? It might be, maybe you now have a backfill on your role, but you haven't interviewed in a year. And it's times like that when it's most important to really be ensuring you've had some time to practice. So I love that idea.
And that I guess also incentivizing the interviewers, like that is an extra feather in their cap when it comes time for performance review. They can add that they are adding to the company culture by being an interviewer, by conducting interviews or giving feedback. And I think a thing that Alex touched on about developing an engineering culture. If you step back and think about it, your interviewers are actually ambassadors for your engineering culture. They are giving the candidate an idea of the archetypes or the type of people that they're going to be working with, what that company actually, not the fancy stuff that's written by marketing that's hanging on the wall, but what are the people that they're working with actually going to value? So, having them go into that mindset of I'm an ambassador for that company, and I want my cadre of interviewers to reflect the type of engineering organization I want to have from a values perspective, from a diversity perspective. Like, your interviewers should look like the workforce or the engineering culture that you want to build.
Absolutely. And I love that it's something that you can then talk about in performance reviews, because it is crucial, right? So many times, it's things like this, investing time in becoming a better interviewer, or spending time on DEI practices that a lot of times doesn't get recognized. And so I love tying it back to something that you do give somebody kudos for at performance review time, and really acknowledge, hey, they're taking the time to up-level their interview skills to create a better team, which I think is really amazing. And so next question on the list here is, where are you leveraging technical assessments in the interview process? Especially right now, there's so many people being hired, people are landing jobs really quickly. And, referencing something that I think either Dominique or Alex commented on, it takes time for the other person to be doing this assessment. And we need to take that into account as well in this whole process. And so I would, Frank, why don't we get started with you about where are you leveraging, technical assessments in this process?
Yeah, so I definitely think it depends on the type of role. If the person is going to be a technical IC or an Eng manager, then I'm going to want more data on the technical pieces. So I'm a fan of having either panel, not panelers. I'm a fan of having multiple interviews, which you still want to be respectful of people's time. But let's say ideal organization, you do 4 interviews. Let's say your standard process is 4 interviews. If I'm, talking to someone who's going to be pushing code, that's, part of their performance, then I'm going to use that 4 interviews. I'm going to skew it more heavily on the technical side, versus if I have someone who's like in a tech plus role, like a TPM, and they're not necessarily pushing code, or they're a TPM, and I'm expecting them to have a high level understanding of system architecture, not to have ever deployed a Kubernetes cluster before, then I'm still going to have a technical evaluation in there, but maybe I only have 1, instead of where if I'm hiring for a senior engineer or Eng manager, I might have 3, because I'm expecting a higher level of experience, and I need more data to evaluate at the higher levels.
Absolutely. Brendan, do you want to chat a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Frank was talking about, the differences between different roles, but I think where the technical assessment fits in your process also depends on what kind of the company it is. So like a huge company like Google, they might have, more applicants than they can possibly process. So they need some kind of technical assessment that scales, that they can implement early in the process. And I'm a big believer in doing the technical assessment early in the process, because I think it doesn't, we don't want to waste anyone's time. If they don't have the skills that we're looking for, or if the role just isn't a good fit for them, we want to know that early in the process. But on the other hand, I don't really like it being the first thing out of the gate. I think that's kind of an unfriendly experience as a candidate. If your first contact with the company is pass this test. So if your company and your applicant pool supports it, I really like the idea of it being the sort of second stage. So having an initial screening call that kind of some sort of human touch with this candidate first, and you speak to them as a person first. And then the next stage after that would be the technical assessment. So that's how I like to do it. But it depends on your company and whether you can fit that process.
Yes, I completely agree. I definitely like to get a little bit of the human touch, and I've seen that works much better with candidates than just sending them a blind assessment. And Dominique, what about you?
Well, maybe to take the spin on Brendan's answer is like, where should you not do it? Probably the first, like the absolute first touch point, and ideally not your last. Like, we've designed our loop in such a way that your last interview is often more of a leadership interview or what we consider like a values add type interview. And so we leave that as like the final step where you potentially get to meet your actual manager, you get to ask questions about the role itself, and then we also really validate that you're going to be adding different skills to our team, and also maybe the leveling if we haven't gotten a good read during the technical assessment. And then beyond that, we often, especially for software engineers, all of our interviews might be technical assessments, but then the percentage of which we're looking at potentially other complementary skills like project management and communication, just there's like a different spread depending on the type of interview.
Awesome. Well, I can't believe it, but we're already at 9:45. So our time is already up. And I first wanted to say thank you to Frank, Dominique, Brendan, and Alex for joining me today. Your insights have been amazing. Some of the highlights, I include things like, hey, is it really possible to make it equitable, and changing your thought about that, and really thinking about what are the trade-offs and can you be transparent, and really, involving the people who are actually doing the job in this evaluation process, and realizing that bias is something we all have. So how can we, reduce it through our assessment process? And so we'll be over in the hiring channel in the Lead Dev Slack. And so we can head there and answer any remaining questions that the audience might have. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you next time.